Hello there, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend a little piece of your evening, morning, or maybe somewhere in between winding down with me. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a time when we were not the only humans that dominated this planet. 40,000 years ago, in the cold, windswept valleys and dense forests of Ice Age Europe, two kinds of humans walked the earth. One of them was us, Homo sapiens. The other was the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are not the hunched primitive caricatures you might have seen in old books. They were strong, intelligent, and resourceful, perfectly adapted to survive in a world that would challenge even the toughest among us today. Their minds were capable of planning and problem solving. They made tools from stone with precision and skill. They controlled fire, stitched warm clothing from animal hides, and buried their dead with care and ceremony. They endured multiple ice ages, hunted giant beasts, mammoths and bisons with nothing but spears and courage. They were human, just not our species of human. And we met them, spoke to them, lived alongside them, and sometimes had children with them. For over 300,000 years, far longer than our modern civilization has existed, they thrived and seemed unstoppable. By all logic, they should still be here. So what could have erased such a people completely? Was it us, competing for the same food and shelter until there was nothing left for them? Did a sudden shift in climate tear apart the fragile web of life they depended on? Did disease spread through their small, scattered communities? Or was their fate sealed by something even stranger, something hidden deep in the story of our own survival? Tonight, we'll follow the clues they left behind, the fossils, the ancient tools, and strands of DNA to uncover what really happened to the Neanderthals and what their fate might still be trying to tell us about our future. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, it would mean so much if you gave this video a gentle like, or perhaps subscribed for more sleepy science stories like this one. And if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now get comfortable. Maybe pull the covers a little closer, let your mind soften, and let's begin. If you were to stand face to face with a Neanderthal, you might be surprised by how human they would look. They were shorter on average than most people today, often around 5.5 feet tall, yet their bodies were built with a density and power that would put most modern athletes to shame. Broad shoulders, deep chests, and thick limb bones spoke of lives spent in constant motion, lifting, carrying, hunting, and enduring the strain of a demanding environment. Their hands were strong, with thick fingers capable of gripping a stone tool for hours without tiring. Every feature of their build tells the same story. They were shaped by the cold, and they were made to survive it. Their stocky frames helped conserve heat in the freezing winds of Ice Age Europe. Shorter limbs meant less surface area for body heat to escape, while layers of muscle acted as insulation as well as strength. Their faces were distinct, with heavy brow ridges and wide noses that likely warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. These were not primitive distortions, but adaptations, finely tuned to their world. Inside their skulls was something even more remarkable. The average Neanderthal brain was actually larger than the average brain of a modern human. Not dramatically so, but enough to raise fascinating questions. A larger brain does not automatically mean greater intelligence, yet it suggests a different balance of abilities. Some scientists believe their enlarged areas related to vision and body control were essential for navigating the dim light of high latitudes and the physical demands of their lifestyle. Others wonder if this brain structure also supported rich, complex social lives and problem-solving skills, We may never know exactly how they thought, but it is clear they were far from mindless brutes. The old image of Neanderthals as slow, dim-witted creatures is one science has steadily dismantled. Archaeological sites reveal the opposite, evidence of forethought, cooperation, and even creativity. The tools they made were not haphazardly chipped rocks, but carefully shaped instruments designed for specific purposes. Some were crafted using the Levallois technique, a method that requires visualizing the final shape of a flake before striking it from the stone core. This level of planning is a window into minds capable of abstract thinking. Their behavior also speaks to intelligence beyond mere survival. We know they controlled fire, using it not only for warmth and cooking, but also to harden wooden spear tips, making them more effective in the hunt. We have evidence that they selected and transported specific types of stone from distant sources, suggesting trade or at least the sharing of knowledge between groups. Some sites contain pigment stains and perforated shells, hinting at the use of body paint or personal ornaments. These touches, small though they seem, speak to symbolic thought, the ability to assign meaning to objects, to express identity, and perhaps even to tell stories. There are signs they cared for the sick and injured, tending to those who could no longer contribute to the hunt. This willingness to help one another without immediate reward suggests a depth of empathy that we once thought belonged only to us. In caves where the remains of their dead have been found, some bodies appear to have been placed with intention, as if burial carried a meaning beyond simple disposal. Whether this was spiritual belief, respect for the individual, or both, it shows that their minds were attuned to more than just the present moment. From their physical strength to the subtle traces of their thoughts left behind in stone, bone, and ochre, the Neanderthals were not lesser versions of us. They were another way of being human, shaped by a different path through time, yet driven by the same challenges that have always defined survival. And in the world they inhabited, every adaptation, whether muscle, mind, or meaning, was a tool for life. The world of the Neanderthals was one of extremes. Imagine stepping out into a landscape where the air bites at your skin and every breath turns to mist before your eyes. Much of Europe and Asia during the Ice Age was gripped by cold that could freeze rivers solid for months. Vast glaciers, some hundreds of feet thick, crawled across the land like slow-moving walls of ice. In the open plains, winds swept unhindered across miles of frozen ground, carrying with them stinging particles of snow and grit. These winds were so sharp and constant that they carved the edges of rocks and stripped the bark from trees. Winters were long and brutal, while summers were brief, offering only a small window for growth and renewal. Yet even in this unforgiving climate, life persisted. Towering herds of mammoths moved across the tundra, their massive bodies covered in shaggy coats, tusks curling like ivory crescents. Woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and reindeer roamed the grasslands, each adapted in its own way to endure the cold. In some regions, wild horses galloped in tight groups, kicking up clouds of frost as they fled predators. Along the coasts and rivers, seals, fish, and seabirds offered valuable resources for those who could reach them. The Neanderthals lived among these creatures, relying on their keen observation and skill to know when and where they could find their next meal. The land was not entirely barren. In sheltered valleys, hardy plants pushed through the thin soil during the short growing season. Berries, nuts, and roots appeared in certain months, providing vital nutrition when meat was scarce. These seasonal plants could be gathered and stored for later use, a practice that required foresight and knowledge of the changing environment. In some places, the edges of glaciers created wetlands where fresh water and plant life thrived, attracting both animals and the humans who hunted them. Neanderthals were spread across an immense range, from the Iberian Peninsula in what is now Spain and Portugal, through the forests and grasslands of Central Europe, across the steppes of Eastern Europe, and as far as the windswept plains of Siberia. They also reached into the Middle East, where the climate was warmer and the terrain offered different challenges. This wide distribution shows their ability to adapt to many environments, from icy tundra to temperate woodlands. In each of these regions, they used local resources with precision, learning the migration patterns of animals, the seasonal changes in plants, and the safest shelters against storms. In the far north, where the winters were longest, survival often depended on the great herds. A successful hunt could mean weeks of food, hides for clothing and shelter, and bones for tools. In the warmer southern areas, the diet could be more varied, with access to coastal waters, shellfish, and even edible plants year-round. But no matter where they lived, the Neanderthals faced constant challenges from predators, shifting weather, and the demands of securing enough food for their groups. The world they inhabited was not static. Glaciers advanced and retreated over centuries, reshaping valleys and changing the routes animals traveled. Rivers shifted course, forests expanded and then withered, and grasslands turned to marshes or to dry, wind-blown steppe. Every generation of Neanderthals had to relearn the patterns of the land, adjusting their movements and methods to match the Earth's restless rhythms. Their ability to survive in such varied and changing landscapes tells us much about their resilience, and it set the stage for encounters that would change their history forever. The Neanderthals were masters of survival in a world that constantly tested the limits of endurance. In the heart of an ice age, when bitter winds swept across plains of snow and predators prowled the darkness, they had skills that allowed them not only to endure, but to thrive for hundreds of thousands of years. One of their greatest strengths was their command over fire. They could coax flames from dry twigs and embers, even in damp conditions. A fire was far more than light and warmth. It was protection, a barrier against the sharp teeth and claws that lurked beyond the glow. It was a place to cook meat, making it easier to chew and digest, releasing more energy from every bite. Around the flames, families could gather in the coldest nights, sharing food and passing on knowledge. Fire also served as a tool in the hunt, driving game into traps or open ground where skilled hands waited with spears. In their hands, stone became an extension of thought and intention. The Neanderthals crafted a distinctive set of tools, now known as Mousterian technology. This was not crude rock bashing. It was a careful process of shaping flakes and points from flint and other stones, each piece made for a specific purpose. Some were sharp enough to skin a reindeer without damaging the hide. Others were heavy and sturdy, capable of breaking the thick bones of mammoths to reach the rich marrow inside. With these tools, they could butcher an entire animal with efficiency, ensuring nothing went to waste. Spears tipped with stone points allowed them to bring down large prey, working together in coordinated hunts that required planning, patience, and trust. Shelter was another key to survival. In many regions, caves provided natural refuge from the elements. These spaces could be warmed with fire, insulated with animal hides, and arranged to keep sleeping areas dry and safe. Where caves were not available, Neanderthals built temporary structures using wood, bones, and hides. Some were framed with mammoth tusks and ribs, then covered with thick skins to block the wind. These shelters could be dismantled and moved as the group followed migrating herds or shifted territories with the seasons. Archaeological sites show signs of organized living spaces, with areas for tool making, food preparation, and sleeping, suggesting a level of order and cooperation essential for life in such a harsh environment. These skills were not learned overnight. They were the result of generations observing the patterns of nature and refining techniques to fit the challenges of their world. Fire, tools, and shelter worked together as part of a survival system, each one supporting the others. A warm shelter kept the group healthy enough to hunt, tools made hunting more successful, fire ensured that food could be cooked and preserved, and that dangerous animals kept their distance. This balance allowed Neanderthals to endure in landscapes where lesser prepared beings would have perished. It was a way of life perfectly tuned to the Ice Age, a rhythm that seemed unbreakable until the world around them began to change in ways they could not have foreseen. The story of the Neanderthals is written not just in tools and artifacts, but in the very bones they left behind. Fossils, sometimes preserved for tens of thousands of years in the cold earth of caves and riverbanks, offer a direct window into their lives. These remains speak of strength, resilience, and the realities of survival in a dangerous world. When scientists examine Neanderthal skeletons, one of the first things they notice is the robustness of the bones. The limb bones are thick and dense, built to withstand incredible strain. Muscle attachment points are large, showing that their bodies were heavily muscled compared to ours. Even their hands, preserved in fossil form, reveal broad, strong fingers, capable of gripping and shaping stone tools for hours without tiring. Their chests were wide, and their rib cages flared, suggesting powerful lungs suited to cold, oxygen-thin air. The combination of strength and endurance would have been essential for stalking large animals across open plains or hauling heavy carcasses back to camp. But their bones also tell a story of hardship. Many Neanderthal skeletons show injuries, some of them severe. Broken arms, fractured legs, and damaged skulls are not uncommon. Some of these wounds likely came from close encounters with large animals during hunts, while others may have been the result of accidents in rugged terrain. What is remarkable, however, is that many of these injuries had healed long before death. A Neanderthal with a crushed limb bone or a broken rib would have needed weeks, perhaps months, to recover. Survival in that time meant that others in the group must have cared for them, provided food, protected them, and helped them move when necessary. This evidence of long-term healing is one of the clearest signs that Neanderthals were not only strong individuals, but members of close-knit communities where cooperation and compassion had a place alongside survival. The bones also hold quieter, more gradual records of a lifetime's wear. Many Neanderthal remains show signs of arthritis, even in relatively young individuals. Their joints often bear the marks of repetitive, heavy use, as if their bodies were pushed to the limits from an early age. Knees and hips sometimes show degeneration from constant walking over uneven ground, and shoulders carry the wear of repeated spear thrusts or the hauling of game. Teeth tell their own story, worn down from chewing tough meat and fibrous plants, sometimes even showing grooves that suggest they use their teeth like a third hand, gripping hides or fibers while working. In some cases, microscopic analysis reveals that grit from stone tools ended up in their food, slowly grinding down enamel over the years. Every fracture, every worn joint, and every healed wound adds to a portrait of a people who lived intensely physical lives. The marks left on their bones are not simply signs of suffering, but of endurance and adaptation. They show how Neanderthals navigated a world where survival demanded constant movement, strength, and cooperation, yet also allowed space for care and mutual support when the body failed. It is in these silent, enduring records that the human side of their story comes into sharp focus, preparing us to look more closely at what happened when their world began to overlap with ours. The first meetings between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were not recorded in words, but in the quiet traces left behind in stone, soil, and bone. Archaeologists have pieced together this story by studying sites scattered across Europe and Western Asia, where the two species once lived side by side. The earliest evidence suggests that modern humans began entering Neanderthal territories roughly between 50 and 60,000 years ago. These were not sudden invasions, but slow movements of people following herds, seeking new resources, and exploring unfamiliar landscapes. Step by step, our ancestors crossed mountains, rivers, and open plains until they reached the same caves and hunting grounds that Neanderthals had used for thousands of years. In some places, layers of earth tell the story of overlap. Excavations reveal Neanderthal tools and hearths in one layer, then tools made by Homo sapiens in the layer just above. In certain sites, the two layers blend, suggesting there were times when both groups occupied the same area, perhaps even at the same time. These shared spaces may have been rich hunting grounds or sheltered valleys where game was plentiful. It is possible that the two species saw each other across the open tundra or at the edge of a forest, each assessing the other with curiosity or caution. The landscapes they shared were not always vast and empty. In certain regions, the best caves and riverbanks would have been valuable real estate for survival. Archaeological signs point to periods when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens might have alternated their use of these places, returning season after season. Charcoal from old fires, fragments of stone tools, and animal bones split for marrow hint at lives lived in close proximity. Whether they traded goods or only competed for resources is still uncertain, but the evidence suggests that their worlds were not entirely separate. The most direct proof of interaction comes not from artifacts, but from within us. Modern genetic studies have revealed that people today, except for those whose ancestors never left Africa, carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. This is the undeniable signature of interbreeding. It means that at some point, members of the two groups formed bonds close enough to produce children. These connections may have been rare or common in certain regions, but they left a permanent mark on our species. Some of the genes we inherited are linked to immune system function, possibly giving early Homo sapiens a better chance of surviving in northern climates. Others may influence traits such as hair, skin, or metabolism. Finding this genetic evidence has reshaped our understanding of those first meetings. They were not simply encounters between strangers who remained apart. They were moments of contact that could lead to cooperation, conflict, or intimacy. The boundaries between the two species were not impassable walls, but more like shifting lines that sometimes blurred. As the presence of Homo sapiens in Neanderthal lands grew, these meetings would become more frequent, setting the stage for a period of change that neither group could have fully anticipated. When Homo sapiens entered Neanderthal territories, the land was already rich with life, yet harsh in its demands. Vast herds of reindeer, bison, and wild horses moved across the plains, following seasonal grazing routes. Woolly mammoths trampled frozen ground, and in the warmer months, rivers brimmed with fish. Both species relied heavily on these resources, and it is here that the theory of direct competition begins to take shape. If two skilled hunters target the same herds and gather from the same berry patches or root beds, the balance of survival can quickly shift. Even in times of plenty, nature rarely produces enough to support two apex predators with similar needs in the same place for long. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals likely hunted in different ways, but the overlap in prey species would have been unavoidable. Neanderthals were powerful, close-range hunters, using thrusting spears to bring down large animals. Their strategies relied on strength, cooperation, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, brought with them a growing range of tools that could extend hunting reach and improve efficiency. Stone-tipped projectiles and lighter spears allowed for striking from a distance, reducing the risk of injury. Over time, this advantage might have meant more successful hunts with fewer casualties. The competition was not limited to the animals themselves. Many of the best hunting grounds were concentrated in specific areas, such as river valleys where migrating herds crossed, or narrow passes where prey could be more easily trapped. These prime locations were the lifeblood of survival, and controlling them would have been critical. If Homo sapiens were more mobile, able to travel greater distances in search of game, they could have scouted and occupied these sites before Neanderthals arrived. Once secured, such places could be defended or repeatedly used, leaving less opportunity for Neanderthal groups to replenish their food stores. Efficiency extended beyond weapons. Homo sapiens may have processed animal carcasses more completely, extracting marrow, fat, and hides in ways that maximized every resource. Better preservation techniques, such as smoking or drying meat, could have allowed them to store food for leaner months. This would reduce the pressure to hunt constantly, giving them an energy and time advantage over Neanderthal groups who may have relied more on fresh kills. Even small improvements in efficiency could accumulate over years, tipping the scales in subtle but decisive ways. Gathering plant foods was another potential source of competition. While Neanderthals did eat some plants, seeds, and nuts, Homo sapiens are believed to have had a more diverse diet, which included a wider variety of gathered foods. This flexibility could have allowed them to adapt better when large game was scarce, further reducing the availability of edible plants for Neanderthals in certain areas. Over generations, this steady pressure might have forced Neanderthals to retreat from their most valuable territories. Displacement from prime hunting grounds would not only mean fewer immediate resources, but also reduced long-term survival prospects. The edges of their range could have been harsher, with more limited prey and less shelter from extreme weather. As Homo sapiens expanded, Neanderthals may have found themselves increasingly confined to these marginal lands, making each winter harder to endure and each spring more uncertain, until survival itself became a question of whether there was enough left to go around. In the archaeological record, the bones of some Neanderthals bear silent but telling scars. Skulls with puncture wounds that match the shape of spear tips, long bones with clean breaks that suggest a sudden, forceful blow rather than an accidental fall. In some cases, the injuries are in places unlikely to result from hunting accidents, such as the side or back of the head, pointing instead to violence between individuals or groups. These wounds tell a story that cannot be heard in words, but which speaks clearly in the language of injury and survival. It is possible that many of these injuries were the result of territorial disputes. The Ice Age landscape was not a boundless wilderness filled with easy resources. It was a mosaic of valleys, rivers, and hunting corridors where game was most plentiful, and these areas would have been as valuable as gold. If a Neanderthal group had occupied a rich reindeer crossing or a sheltered cave for years, the sudden arrival of Homo sapiens could have brought tension. Each side would have understood the stakes. Control of a hunting ground could mean the difference between enduring the winter or starving before spring. Encounters may have started with standoffs at a distance, with both groups watching from the safety of high ground or the edge of a forest. But as pressure on resources grew, patience would have worn thin. A confrontation at a riverbank or in a narrow pass could escalate into thrown stones, hurled spears, or a rush of bodies crashing together. In such moments, strength, numbers, and strategy would decide who walked away and who was left behind. The possibility of organized raids cannot be ruled out. Homo sapiens, with their greater mobility and potentially more complex social networks, might have been able to plan and execute surprise attacks to drive Neanderthals from key locations. A small party could strike at dawn when a camp's fire had burned low, or during a snowstorm when visibility was poor. The aim would not always be to kill, but to instill fear, seize territory, and scatter the group so they could no longer defend their resources. Such raids would have left lasting marks, not only in the bones of the injured, but in the memories of survivors. Fear could drive a group to abandon a rich hunting ground without a fight if they believed their attackers would return. This cycle of pressure and retreat could, over time, shrink Neanderthal ranges, forcing them into harsher and less productive landscapes. The further they were pushed from prime valleys and coasts, the more difficult it became to sustain large groups, and the more vulnerable they became to both hunger and further attacks. Even without direct evidence of every encounter, the patterns of injury and the shifting boundaries of Neanderthal settlements suggest that violence was more than a rare event. It was another layer of survival, woven into the constant struggle for food, shelter, and safety, where the outcome was determined not only by the cold and the hunt, but also by the presence of another species that was willing to fight for the same ground. When we try to imagine what set Homo sapiens apart from Neanderthals, one of the most compelling ideas is that our minds worked just a little differently. Not in raw brain size, because Neanderthals often had brains that were slightly larger than ours, but in how those brains processed information. Many scientists suggest that Homo sapiens may have had a stronger ability for abstract thinking. This is the skill of taking an idea, a pattern, or a possibility that does not physically exist in front of you and turning it into something useful or meaningful in the real world. It is the leap from seeing a rock to imagining the shape of a tool hidden inside it before a single strike is made. Abstract thinking is the foundation of symbolic thought. It is what allows people to create art, tell stories, and pass down ideas that extend far beyond immediate survival. When archaeologists look at the earliest sites of Homo sapiens in Europe, they often find beads carved from bone, shells with holes drilled for necklaces, and pigments that were likely used for body paint or rock art. These were not necessary for staying alive, yet they served a different kind of purpose, reinforcing identity, group belonging, and shared meaning. Such expressions might also have been a way to teach, warn, or inspire, keeping knowledge alive through generations. Neanderthals also left hints of symbolic behavior, such as ochre pigments and possible carvings, but these appear far less frequently in the archaeological record. It is possible that their communities created and used symbols in ways that have not survived in the fossil record, yet the difference in frequency is striking. The cultural explosion seen among Homo sapiens, the rapid spread of decorative items, painted caves, and complex tools suggests a faster pace of innovation. This speed matters in a changing world, where new challenges require not only strength, but also quick, creative solutions. Innovation was not just about making something new, It was about improving and adapting existing tools to fit new needs. A spear could become lighter and more aerodynamic. A scraper could be reshaped to process hides more efficiently. Homo sapiens seemed able to experiment and pass on these improvements at a rate that gradually widened the gap between the two species. The ability to imagine a different way of doing something, test it, and then communicate the results may have given us an edge that grew with each generation. Faster adaptation might have been one of the most powerful advantages of all. In the shifting climates of the Ice Age, a sudden change in available prey or a new environmental hazard could be devastating. A group that could quickly alter hunting strategies, invent new tools, or find substitutes for scarce materials would have been better equipped to survive. These changes did not have to be dramatic. Even small, incremental improvements could accumulate into a significant survival advantage over time. From the ability to plan a hunt in advance to the creation of symbolic objects that strengthened group cohesion, to the willingness to experiment with tools and techniques, the cognitive edge of Homo sapiens may have been subtle in the moment, but profound in its long-term effects, shaping the unfolding story of human survival and the eventual disappearance of our closest relatives. During the final chapters of the Neanderthal story, the climate of Ice Age Europe and Asia was anything but stable. The world they knew was a place of extremes, but it was not a slow, predictable cycle of cold and warmth. Instead, the evidence in ice cores and sediment layers tells us that the climate could swing violently in just a few decades, shifting from bitter, dry cold to relatively warmer and wetter conditions and back again. These sudden transitions are sometimes called climate whiplash because of the speed and intensity with which they happened. Imagine a Neanderthal community living in a valley they had used for generations. They would have known the rhythms of the seasons, the routes of migrating herds, and the places where plants could be gathered when the snow retreated. Then, within the span of a single lifetime, the patterns could shatter. Temperatures could plummet, turning once reliable rivers into frozen wastelands. Grasslands that fed vast herds of bison or mammoth could vanish under advancing glaciers or be replaced by barren tundra. For a species with smaller and more scattered populations, such changes could erase vital hunting grounds in the time it took for a child to grow into an adult. The impact on the food chain would have been immediate and severe. Large herbivores depended on stable grazing grounds, and when the plants they relied on disappeared, their numbers collapsed. Carnivores, including Neanderthals, followed this decline. In warmer phases, new plant growth might allow herds to recover, but the timing and location of these resources would be different from before. Hunting skills honed for one environment could suddenly become less effective in another, forcing groups to adapt quickly or move on in search of more abundant lands. Migration under these conditions was not simply a matter of walking to a better location. Glaciers could block entire regions, rivers could shift their courses, and familiar landscapes could be swallowed by ice or transformed into arid steppe. For Neanderthal bands, whose territories were often smaller and whose movements tended to stay within familiar ranges, these barriers could mean isolation. Once cut off from other groups, they faced reduced opportunities to share resources, exchange mates, or learn new survival strategies from their neighbors. The instability also added pressure to store and preserve food whenever possible. A sudden cold snap could destroy stored plant foods or drive away game animals before enough had been gathered for the season. In such times, hunger would set in quickly, and small groups already weakened by scarcity could lose members faster than they could replace them. Each loss was not only a missing hunter or gatherer, but also a loss of knowledge, skill, and shared memory of the land. Environmental instability did not just affect the body, it tested the mind. Navigating an unpredictable world required constant observation, flexible planning, and the ability to think ahead about shifting seasons and migrating prey. For populations already scattered across a harsh continent, each new climate swing chipped away at the delicate balance between survival and collapse, setting the stage for the next challenge that would push them even closer to the edge. When two human species meet, the exchange is never just about tools, ideas, or territory. It is also about the invisible passengers each one carries within their bodies. When Homo sapiens first entered Neanderthal lands, they brought with them microorganisms that their own immune systems had learned to live with. To them, these bacteria and viruses might have caused only mild illness, a few days of fever, or a temporary rash. But to Neanderthals, whose immune systems had never encountered these pathogens, the arrival of such microscopic invaders could have been catastrophic. Genetics plays a major role in how our bodies respond to disease. Over thousands of years, populations develop immune defenses tailored to the infections common in their environment. For Homo sapiens living in Africa, those defenses had been shaped by generations of exposure to tropical and subtropical pathogens. When they moved north into Europe and Asia, they carried this immunological history within their DNA. Neanderthals, however, had evolved in colder climates where disease patterns were different. They may never have faced certain viruses or bacteria that were widespread among African populations. This mismatch meant that their immune systems were unprepared for the microbial newcomers. For an isolated group, even a single outbreak could ripple through the community with deadly speed. Neanderthals lived in relatively small bands, often numbering only a few dozen individuals. In such tight-knit groups, close contact was unavoidable. A cough or a sneeze could pass illness from one person to another in a matter of hours. If several adults fell ill at the same time, hunting and gathering would slow or stop altogether. Injured or elderly members might go without care. Children, with weaker immune systems, could be the first to succumb. It is possible that some of these diseases were not the dramatic killers we imagine in modern pandemics, but rather slow, grinding illnesses, a stomach parasite that sapped energy, a skin infection that spread easily, or a respiratory disease that lingered for weeks could weaken an entire group without wiping it out immediately. Over time, repeated bouts of sickness would leave them undernourished and less able to withstand other challenges such as cold snaps or food shortages. The effects of disease on a small population are magnified because there are fewer individuals to replace those who are lost. If a group of 40 loses 5 people to illness in a single winter, the social and genetic impact is enormous. Skills that one or two individuals specialized in, like crafting a specific hunting weapon or knowing the best seasonal plants to gather, could disappear entirely if those people died. Survivors might be forced to adapt to tasks they had never performed before, slowing down the efficiency of daily life. Pathogens do not leave obvious marks on bones, so the archaeological record is mostly silent on exactly which diseases might have been involved. Yet the genetic legacy of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens hints at an ancient arms race between immune systems and the microbes that challenge them. This silent, unseen struggle would have unfolded alongside every other pressure they faced, setting the stage for the next force that would push their numbers even lower. When we think of one species replacing another, we often picture a clear ending, but in the case of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, the story is not quite so simple. Instead of disappearing entirely through competition or catastrophe, Some Neanderthals may have been absorbed into the population of modern humans through interbreeding. This means that rather than a sharp extinction, there was a blending of lineages that still echoes in our genes today. Genetic studies have revealed that people outside of Africa carry a small but significant percentage of Neanderthal DNA, usually between 1 and 2%. This is not a random trace. It is evidence that our ancestors and Neanderthals met, lived alongside one another, and formed relationships close enough to produce children. These unions were not a single event but likely happened multiple times across different regions, from the rolling plains of Ice Age Europe to the forested valleys of Western Asia. For a long time, scientists debated whether the contact between the two species was fleeting or sustained. The DNA evidence makes it clear that it was sustained enough to leave a lasting mark on the modern human genome. In fact, some of the genetic sequences we carry from Neanderthals are linked to very specific traits, suggesting that these inherited fragments may have offered survival advantages. Some of these traits involve our immune systems. Certain Neanderthal genes appear to have helped modern humans adapt to new pathogens encountered in Eurasia. By inheriting these genes, Homo sapiens may have gained a better defense against local diseases, giving them a crucial edge when settling in unfamiliar environments. Other inherited genes influence skin and hair. Variations affecting skin pigmentation, hair texture, and even the way our bodies respond to sunlight have been connected to Neanderthal ancestry. These changes could have helped our ancestors cope with the lower light levels and colder climates of northern latitudes. Not all inherited traits are necessarily beneficial. Some Neanderthal genetic sequences are linked to conditions such as allergies, certain autoimmune disorders, and even tendencies toward depression. This suggests that while interbreeding broadened our genetic toolkit, it also carried along vulnerabilities that persist in human populations today. The blend of advantages and disadvantages paints a complex picture of what it means to inherit from another species. The idea of the hybrid theory shifts the way we see Neanderthals. They were not simply a failed branch of the human family tree. In a sense, they live on within us, their DNA woven into our biology, shaping aspects of who we are. The faces of the children born from these unions would have carried features from both worlds. The strong, broad structure of a Neanderthal combined with the more slender build of a Homo sapiens. Over generations, those distinct traits would have softened, blending into the diversity of appearances that modern humans display today. This quiet genetic merging was not the only force at play in the Neanderthal story, but it meant that even as their separate identity faded, a part of their legacy endured, moving forward through time in the bloodlines of the humans who walked on. In the frozen landscapes where Neanderthals lived, survival was a constant calculation between energy gained and energy spent. Much of their diet came from hunting large game such as mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and giant deer. These animals provided enormous amounts of meat and fat, which were essential for surviving in cold climates where plant foods were scarce for much of the year. But this dependence also came with a dangerous risk. Large animals do not reproduce quickly. If herds moved away, declined in number, or were lost to disease, the food supply could vanish almost overnight. Tracking these animals often meant following their seasonal migrations across treacherous terrain. A single hunt could take days and require a tremendous investment of energy from every member of the group. The rewards were great when a hunt was successful, but the penalty for failure was harsh. In periods when the climate shifted suddenly, or when competition for prey increased, Neanderthals may have faced long stretches without a major kill. Such gaps in food availability could quickly turn into famine. When prey was scarce, Neanderthals likely turned to smaller animals, fish, or foraged plants where possible. But these options did not provide the same dense nutrition that large animals offered. In winter, edible plants were extremely limited, and smaller prey required more time and energy to catch, often yielding less than what was needed to sustain the group. This imbalance could lead to a slow but steady decline in health, especially for children, the elderly, and pregnant women who needed the most nourishment. Modern science has found direct evidence of these nutritional stresses in Neanderthal remains. By studying the chemical isotopes locked within their bones and teeth, researchers can reconstruct aspects of their diet. The ratios of certain isotopes, such as nitrogen 15, reveal that Neanderthals occupied a high position in the food chain, much like top predators today. These readings confirm that they consumed a diet rich in meat. However, isotope patterns in some individuals also show fluctuations that suggest periods of reduced protein intake, hinting at times when hunting success was low or when they were forced to diversify their food sources out of necessity. Signs of malnutrition can also be read in the physical condition of the bones. In some cases, researchers have found evidence of interrupted growth during childhood, a possible sign of prolonged hunger or illness linked to poor diet. Tooth enamel often records these hardships too, with faint horizontal lines indicating periods when the body temporarily halted normal development to conserve energy. These clues reveal that the lives of Neanderthals were not a steady rhythm of abundance, but a constant balancing act between feast and famine. The reliance on large game brought moments of plenty, yet it also made them vulnerable to sudden shortages when herds declined or shifted their ranges. As climate instability, competition with Homo sapiens, and environmental pressures mounted, the gaps between these feasts may have grown longer, straining even the most resilient groups and leaving lasting marks in the record written in their bones. For most of their long history, Neanderthals lived in small, scattered groups. They were never a numerous species. Modern estimates suggest their total population may have been fewer than 70,000 individuals across all of Europe and parts of Western Asia at any one time. That is smaller than the population of many modern towns. When a species exists in such low numbers, its survival becomes a fragile balancing act. A single harsh winter, a failed hunting season, or the loss of a few key members of a group could send ripples through the entire population. In these small bands, every person mattered. Skilled hunters, tool makers, and gatherers were not easily replaced. If an accident claimed the life of an experienced tracker, the group's ability to find food might suffer for months or even years. The death of elders meant the loss of crucial knowledge about migration routes, safe shelters, or hidden water sources. In small populations, such losses are not simply personal tragedies. They weaken the group's chances of survival in the long term. Low population density also meant that Neanderthal communities were often isolated from one another. A valley or mountain range could separate one group from the next for months at a time. Without regular contact, there were fewer opportunities for exchanging ideas, tools, or hunting strategies. There was also less opportunity to find mates outside the group, and over many generations, this isolation could reduce genetic diversity. With a smaller gene pool, harmful genetic traits become harder to eliminate, and the population's ability to adapt to new challenges can weaken. The dangers of low genetic diversity become more severe when combined with unpredictable disasters. A volcanic eruption, a sudden disease outbreak, or a shift in climate could wipe out entire groups at once. For a large, widespread species, such events are devastating but often survivable because other populations can repopulate the affected areas. For Neanderthals, with so few communities spread so thinly, such events could mean the permanent loss of significant portions of their population. Even without dramatic catastrophes, random chance alone can have an outsized effect on small populations. A poor hunting season in one region, a shortage of water in another, or the loss of a key shelter site could cause local extinctions. Once a group disappeared, the distance between remaining communities made it unlikely they would be replaced quickly, if at all. Over centuries, these losses added up, gradually shrinking their range and reducing their numbers further. This slow erosion of population strength is not always obvious in the archaeological record, but genetic studies hint at the pressure they were under. DNA extracted from Neanderthal remains shows signs of inbreeding in some later populations, suggesting that as their numbers dwindled, groups had fewer mating choices. This pattern may have reduced their resilience, just as environmental and competitive pressures from Homo sapiens were intensifying. The Neanderthals' fate was shaped not only by external forces, but also by this quiet arithmetic of survival. With so few individuals to begin with, every loss carried a weight that a larger population might have absorbed. And once their numbers fell below a certain point, the road back to stability would have been almost impossible to climb, no matter how skilled or resilient they were. Culture is more than decoration or entertainment. For human societies, it acts as a glue, holding communities together through shared meaning, identity, and values. Art, music, and storytelling are not simply ways to pass the time. They create bonds between people, strengthen cooperation, and give purpose to shared struggles. Among Homo sapiens, these cultural expressions flourished, and they may have been one of the most powerful tools we carried into the Ice Age. When people paint an image on a cave wall or carve patterns into a bone, they are not just making something to look at, they are telling others that they belong to the same group. A painted handprint can serve as a silent declaration: we were here and we were together. Music, even in its simplest form, can create unity. A shared rhythm or song can help synchronize work, encourage group participation, and lift spirits during hard times. Stories, told around a fire, carry lessons about the land, the animals, and the mistakes to avoid. They preserve the memory of past hunts and migrations, and they can pass down survival knowledge across generations. For Homo sapiens, evidence of symbolic culture appears in many forms. Archaeological sites reveal beads made from shells, pigments for body painting, carved figurines, and elaborate burials decorated with objects. These signs suggest that symbolic thinking was woven into daily life, not just reserved for rare moments. Such expressions would have helped bind communities together, giving them a sense of identity that extended beyond the immediate family group. A larger, shared cultural identity could make it easier for different bands to cooperate, trade, and share resources when times were difficult. Neanderthals also left traces of symbolic behavior, but they appear less often in the archaeological record. A few sites have revealed shells stained with pigment, possible necklaces made from animal teeth, and deliberate burials. There is evidence of pigment use that may have been for body painting, and some caves contain markings that could have been intentional designs. These findings show that Neanderthals were capable of symbolic thought. However, such evidence is scattered, and it suggests that these activities may have been less central to their daily lives than they were for Homo sapiens. The difference might seem small, but it could have been significant. In a harsh and changing environment, survival was not only about hunting skill or physical strength, it was also about maintaining connections between groups, forming trust, and encouraging cooperation. Culture helps with that. A group that shares songs, rituals, and symbols can more easily welcome outsiders, create alliances, and coordinate large-scale hunts. The ability to pass down complex knowledge through stories can also speed adaptation to new challenges, helping a population survive rapid environmental changes or shifts in food sources. As Homo sapiens moved into regions already occupied by Neanderthals, their stronger emphasis on symbolic culture may have given them a social advantage. They could form broader networks, share knowledge over greater distances, and maintain unity even when dispersed. In a world where small groups often faced isolation, this ability to weave many communities into one cultural fabric could have been a powerful force for survival, allowing them to thrive in places where others slowly faded from the landscape. Raising a child in the Ice Age was not a matter of gentle afternoons and safe shelter. It was a constant battle against the cold, hunger, and danger that surrounded every step. For both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, childhood was long compared to most animals, which meant years of dependency before a child could contribute fully to the survival of the group. This extended childhood allowed for the learning of complex skills, but it also came with a cost. Every extra year a child relied on adults was another year of vulnerability, where food, protection, and attention had to be provided without fail. In the freezing landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Asia, infants and young children were among the most fragile members of a group. The risk of death before adulthood was high, not only because of predators or accidents, but because of illness, malnutrition, and exposure to the cold. If food supplies ran low, it was often the very young who suffered first. A single harsh winter, a failed hunting season, or an outbreak of disease could mean the loss of several children in one small community. In such small populations, every lost child was not only a personal tragedy, but also a blow to the future survival of the group. Neanderthals, with their smaller population numbers, would have felt these losses even more deeply. If a small band lost 2 or 3 children in a short span of time, the gap in the next generation could not easily be filled. Fewer children reaching adulthood meant fewer hunters, fewer gatherers, and fewer potential parents in the future. In such a precarious balance, even short periods of higher infant mortality could push a population toward decline. Parenting strategies may also have played a role. Neanderthals are believed to have been deeply caring toward their young, with evidence of individuals living into adulthood despite serious injuries or disabilities, suggesting strong social bonds and mutual aid. But their child rearing may have been more focused within the immediate family unit, relying heavily on the mother and close kin. If that was the case, the death or injury of a primary caregiver could have had devastating consequences for dependent children. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, may have practiced more cooperative child rearing, with multiple adults helping to feed, watch over, and teach the young. This alloparenting approach spreads the responsibility of care across the group, meaning that even if a mother was injured or died, the child's chances of survival were higher. This system also allowed mothers to have children slightly closer together, gradually increasing the number of young in the group. Over generations, such a difference could slowly but steadily lead to faster population growth for Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals. In the struggle for survival, numbers mattered. A group that could consistently raise more of its children to adulthood would have more hands to hunt, gather, defend, and reproduce. As environmental pressures grew and competition for resources intensified, the way each species nurtured its young could have been as decisive for survival as the sharpness of their tools or the strength of their hunters. Archaeologists can often read the story of an ancient people not only from their bones but from what they left behind in the soil. For Neanderthals, this story is told through their distinctive stone tool tradition known as the Mousterian toolkit. These tools, shaped with great skill, included sharp flakes for cutting meat, scrapers for cleaning hides, and points for hunting. They were efficient, well made, and suited for the environments Neanderthals lived in, yet they changed very little over tens of thousands of years. This stability suggests mastery of a specific way of doing things, but it also hints at a slower pace of innovation. In contrast, when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe and Asia, their toolkits were more varied and evolved more rapidly. They experimented with bone, antler, and ivory, creating finer, lighter, and more specialized implements. Long, thin blades replaced chunky flakes, making it possible to craft composite tools such as spears with detachable points. This adaptability meant they could adjust their hunting techniques depending on the prey, the terrain, or even the season. Where Neanderthals might return to the same tried and tested tools, Homo sapiens were more likely to invent new solutions when faced with a problem. The speed of innovation mattered in a world where conditions could change within a single lifetime. If the climate shifted and certain animals became scarce, a group's survival could depend on quickly adapting to hunt a different species. If a new raw material, like a particular type of flint or bone, became available, the ability to experiment with it could open entirely new possibilities. For Homo sapiens, this creative flexibility was a powerful advantage. Neanderthals were skilled hunters, capable of bringing down massive animals such as mammoths and bison, but their techniques often relied on close-range encounters. This was dangerous work, as shown by the high rate of injuries in their skeletons. Homo sapiens, however, developed projectile weapons that allowed them to strike from a safer distance. A thrown spear or an atlatl-launched dart meant hunters could target fast or dangerous prey without getting within striking range. Over time, this not only reduced injury rates, but also allowed them to hunt more effectively across a wider range of environments. The difference in tool innovation extended beyond hunting. Homo sapiens crafted needles from bone, which allowed them to stitch together fitted clothing from animal hides. In the depths of an Ice Age winter, a garment tailored to the body could be the difference between life and frostbite. Neanderthals likely wore hides too, but without needles their clothing may have been looser and less insulating, leaving them more vulnerable to the cold. Adaptability also came in the form of resource use. Where Neanderthals might primarily use stone, Homo sapiens were quick to incorporate other materials, combining them in new ways. This flexibility meant they could thrive in areas where high-quality stone was scarce, making tools from whatever was at hand. Such resourcefulness, repeated generation after generation, could gradually tip the balance in favor of one species over the other, especially in regions where survival hinged on innovation. Archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthals were deeply tied to the landscapes they knew. They often occupied the same valleys, caves, and hunting grounds for generations, returning to familiar water sources and well-known migration routes of prey. This intimate knowledge of their territory gave them an advantage in tracking animals and finding seasonal resources, but it also meant they were bound to the limits of that environment. When resources within that range declined, their ability to adapt quickly to new territories was limited. In contrast, Homo sapiens displayed a far greater willingness to travel beyond the horizon. Sites across Ice Age, Europe, and Asia show patterns of raw material transport that stretch far beyond the ranges typical of Neanderthal groups. Flint, obsidian, and shells have been found hundreds of miles from their sources, evidence of either long distance journeys or extensive exchange networks. This mobility was not just about moving from one place to another. It represented a different way of thinking about survival, one that embraced risk in search of opportunity. The difference in mobility meant the two species experienced scarcity in very different ways. For a Neanderthal band, if a drought reduced the herds in their home range, they might endure periods of hunger while waiting for conditions to improve. For Homo sapiens, scarcity was more likely to trigger movement, sending small groups to scout distant valleys or cross unfamiliar terrain in search of new hunting grounds. This mobility increased their chances of encountering untapped resources before desperation set in. Traveling longer distances also meant that Homo sapiens were more exposed to varied environments and climates. Each journey taught them how to adapt to different landscapes, whether it was hunting in dense forests, fishing in coastal waters, or tracking herds across open tundra. This variety of experience created a flexible mindset, one that could be passed down through teaching and storytelling. Over generations, it built a culture that valued exploration as a survival tool. Mobility also expanded the range of resources available. While Neanderthals might rely heavily on the plants and animals within their fixed range, Homo sapiens could tap into seasonal abundance in multiple regions. A group might spend part of the year near rivers rich in fish and waterfowl, then move inland to hunt large game during migration. This seasonal movement helped prevent overexploitation of a single area and spread the risk of food shortages. The ability to move and adapt also affected the way Homo sapiens interacted with other groups. Greater travel distances meant more frequent encounters with outsiders, leading to opportunities for trade, the exchange of ideas, and even the sharing of genetic diversity. Such interactions could strengthen resilience in the face of environmental challenges, whereas isolated Neanderthal groups were more vulnerable to being cut off from vital resources or knowledge. As the Ice Age climate shifted unpredictably, landscapes could change within a lifetime. Rivers might freeze earlier, forests could retreat, and grasslands might vanish under advancing ice. For a species tied to familiar ranges, these changes could be devastating. For one already accustomed to moving across great distances, they were another challenge to navigate. And in the unfolding story of survival, that difference in mobility was not simply about covering ground, it was about keeping options open when the world refused to stay the same. In the deep layers of ancient soil and cave floors, archaeologists have found a remarkable pattern. In some places, the stone tools of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lie almost side by side, separated by only the thinnest line of sediment. This is not the kind of gap that marks centuries. In some cases, it may be the record of only a few generations. Such overlapping layers tell us that these two human species shared the same landscapes, hunted on the same plains, and drank from the same rivers. They were not distant rivals separated by continents. They were neighbors, sometimes within walking distance of one another. Radiocarbon dating and other advanced methods have allowed scientists to narrow the timeline of these encounters. Where once it was thought that Neanderthals vanished tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens filled Europe, the evidence now shows a much shorter gap. In many regions, the difference between their last known presence and the earliest signs of our species is measured not in tens of thousands of years, but in just a few thousand. In archaeological terms, that is the blink of an eye. It means that for a brief but intense period, Two kinds of humans coexisted in the same environments, each trying to survive in a world that could be both rich and unforgiving. The layers of evidence also show how rapidly change unfolded. In some sites, the characteristic tools of Neanderthals, known as Mosterian technology, are suddenly replaced by the more varied and finely crafted blades and points associated with Homo sapiens. This shift can happen within a single layer of occupation, suggesting that the transition from one culture to the other was not a slow drift, but a rapid turnover. It is a silent record of a world in motion, where ways of life could vanish within the span of a lifetime. The narrowing of the extinction window carries profound implications for how quickly the Neanderthal decline took place. If the overlap lasted only a few thousand years, it means that whatever forces pushed them toward disappearance worked fast. This could point to a combination of pressures: competition for resources, sudden climate instability, exposure to new diseases that compounded one another and made recovery impossible. For a species with already small and scattered populations, such pressures could have been devastating within only a few human generations. In some places, the archaeological record even hints at shared moments. Caves containing both Mousterian and early Homo sapiens tools might represent alternating use of the same shelter, perhaps seasonally, or even brief periods of contact and exchange. The physical traces are subtle: a discarded spear point, a layer of hearth ash, but they remind us that this was not simply a story of replacement, it was also one of encounter. The landscape itself became the stage for a human overlap that would never happen again. This compressed timeline, carved into layers of earth, means that the disappearance of the Neanderthals was not the slow fading of a distant species, but a rapid and visible change witnessed by the people who lived through it. And as we move forward in their story, this shrinking window of time sets the stage for the final pressures that would decide which humans remained. In the final millennia of the Neanderthals, the world was already a place of extremes. Vast ice sheets crept across the northern continents, and the climate could shift from bitter cold to brief warmth within the span of a human lifetime. But there is evidence that nature may have delivered additional, devastating blows. One of the leading hypotheses suggests that powerful volcanic eruptions erupted during this fragile period, adding chaos to an already unstable environment. Geological records point to a possible link between Neanderthal decline and a massive volcanic event in Europe known as the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption. It occurred roughly 40,000 years ago in what is now southern Italy, releasing an enormous plume of ash and gas into the atmosphere. The scale of this eruption was so immense that it blanketed parts of Europe and Western Asia in layers of fine volcanic dust. These layers can still be traced today, compressed within the earth, a silent record of a day when the sky turned dark. Climate models help us understand the scale of the impact. When volcanic gases like sulfur dioxide reach the upper atmosphere, they can linger for years, scattering sunlight and causing a sudden global cooling. Even a drop of just a few degrees in average temperature can be enough to disrupt ecosystems. For Ice Age hunters already living close to the limits of survival, the difference between a mild season and a severe one could mean the loss of crucial food sources. Plants grow more slowly in colder, dimmer conditions, and grazing animals have less to eat. As prey numbers dwindle, predators, human and otherwise, must travel farther and compete harder to find sustenance. The ash itself would have had immediate and direct consequences on the ground. Fine volcanic particles can coat leaves and choke streams, making it harder for plants to photosynthesize and for animals to find clean water. Grazing mammals like reindeer and bison Key sources of food for Neanderthals could have suffered heavy losses. The cascading effect on the food chain would have been swift. Fewer herbivores meant fewer opportunities for successful hunts, and with their reliance on large game, Neanderthal communities may have faced severe shortages within just a few seasons. Such eruptions were not isolated events. In the millennia surrounding the Neanderthal extinction, other volcanic disturbances are recorded in ice cores and sediment layers. Each would have released pulses of ash and gas into the atmosphere, acting as sudden and unpredictable triggers for cooling events. The term volcanic winter is used to describe these periods when the sun's warmth was partially blocked and landscapes that were already cold became even harsher. For Neanderthal groups scattered in small, isolated bands, these environmental shocks could have been particularly lethal. While Homo sapiens may have adapted more quickly, shifting their diets and moving across greater distances, Neanderthals appear to have been more tied to familiar hunting grounds. A catastrophic ash cloud drifting across those territories could have stripped them of their most reliable resources almost overnight, forcing desperate choices. And so, within the already complex web of pressures, from competition to climate instability, nature's most violent forces may have acted as sudden accelerants. The layers of ash found in the earth are not just geological markers, they are silent witnesses to moments when survival became even more precarious and the odds tilted further against the Neanderthals. One of the most striking differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may not have been in muscle or intelligence, but in the invisible threads that tied communities together. For our species, survival was not just about the strength of the individual, it was about the strength of the group. Archaeological evidence shows that early Homo sapiens formed larger, more interconnected social networks than Neanderthals, and these networks may have been one of the most powerful tools for enduring in a world that could change without warning. In many regions, signs of long-distance contact appear in the form of stone tools made from materials found hundreds of miles from where they were used. Obsidian blades in one camp might trace their origins to distant volcanic ranges, while shells used for beads could have come from a coastline far beyond the daily hunting range. These objects did not walk there on their own. They were carried, passed from hand to hand, traded between groups who may never have met directly but were linked through chains of contact. Along with goods, ideas could travel this way too. New ways of making a spearhead, new hunting strategies, even knowledge of which plants could heal or harm. This exchange created resilience. If a sudden cold snap reduced game in one area, groups with allies elsewhere could travel to safer hunting grounds or receive supplies through trade. If a new tool design proved more efficient, it could spread across vast territories in a matter of generations, increasing the survival chances of everyone in the network. In a harsh Ice Age environment, this ability to share and borrow solutions was a kind of insurance policy against disaster. For Neanderthals, the picture appears different. Archaeological sites suggest their communities tended to be smaller and more localized. They were skilled at exploiting the resources in familiar territories, but their patterns of movement and contact may have been limited. Raw materials for tools often came from sources much closer to home, and changes in tool design appear to have spread more slowly between groups. Smaller networks meant that if a Neanderthal band lost access to a key resource, they could not easily turn to distant allies for help. Their survival rested on the skills and knowledge contained within their own group, which could make them more vulnerable to sudden environmental or social pressures. There is also the matter of how information is stored and passed on. In large, interconnected societies, Knowledge can survive the loss of individuals because it is distributed among many people in many places. If one group is wiped out by famine or disease, the skills they mastered might still be preserved elsewhere. In smaller, more isolated bands, the death of just a few elders or skilled hunters could erase decades of expertise. Once gone, that knowledge might never be recovered. The difference in cooperation networks is not simply about numbers, it is about reach. Homo sapiens created webs of connection that stretched far beyond the horizon, turning the vast and dangerous Ice Age world into a shared space where ideas, goods, and survival strategies could flow. Neanderthals, bound more closely to the familiar, moved through a world where help was harder to find and where each challenge had to be met with the resources already at hand. This difference in connection would become increasingly important as the pressures facing both species continued to mount. For Neanderthals, survival was never just a matter of food or shelter, it was also a matter of mind and spirit. Life in the Ice Age already demanded constant vigilance, yet when a group began to shrink in size, the emotional weight of existence could grow heavier than the cold itself. A band that once felt vibrant with conversation and laughter might, over the years, dwindle to only a handful of voices. The quiet between those voices could become oppressive. With fewer people to share the burdens of hunting, foraging, and caring for children, the work became harder, the risks greater, and the sense of security weaker. Isolation brought more than loneliness, it narrowed the circle of safety. In small communities, every person mattered. When an elder died, it was not simply a personal loss, but the disappearance of a living library. Elders often carried the memory of where certain plants grew, where herds migrated in hard winters, and where water could be found when rivers ran low. A skilled hunter might know the subtle signs that an animal was nearby or how to track it across frozen ground. Losing even one of these figures could mean losing knowledge that no one else could replace. In a world without writing or maps, such knowledge lived only in memory, and once it was gone forever. The social fabric of a group was delicate, held together by cooperation and trust. When numbers dropped, tension could rise. Fewer hunters meant longer days in the field and more frequent injuries. Those who stayed behind faced greater workloads too, gathering wood, tending fires, and caring for the young and sick. Fatigue and hunger could fray tempers, leading to disputes that would have been rare in better times. Conflict could drive people apart at the very moment they most needed to stay together. The physical pressures of displacement only deepened these stresses. In times of scarcity, Neanderthal groups often had to leave familiar territories in search of better hunting grounds. Moving through unfamiliar landscapes meant constant risk. There were no permanent shelters waiting, no certainty of food, and no guarantee of safety from predators or rival groups. Each move required adapting to new terrain, new climates, and new threats. The psychological strain of never feeling settled could weigh heavily on both body and mind. Even small children would sense the uncertainty, growing up with a constant awareness that home might vanish overnight. As displacement continued, the lack of deep local knowledge in these new places made survival harder. There was no mental map of where to find edible roots or where dangerous cliffs hid under snow. This meant more trial and error, more wasted energy, and more risk of fatal mistakes. Each unsuccessful hunt, each night without enough warmth, added to the mental exhaustion. The strain was not always visible in bones or artifacts, but it lived in the daily decisions, in the quiet moments around a dim fire, and in the constant calculations of whether to stay or move again. This combination of shrinking communities, the loss of experienced members, and the unending uncertainty of displacement formed an invisible but powerful pressure on Neanderthal survival. It was a weight that no single tool or skill could fully lift, yet it shaped the course of their final years as much as any change in climate or competition for resources. The bones of Neanderthals hold more than their shape, they hold their story. Inside those ancient remains, locked within fragile strands of genetic material, lies evidence that tells us not only who they were, but also how they lived, and eventually how their world unraveled. When scientists first extracted Neanderthal DNA from well-preserved fossils, it was like opening a time capsule sealed for tens of thousands of years. Within those sequences of nucleotides, patterns emerged that spoke of population size, migration, and even the challenges they faced as their numbers began to dwindle. One of the most striking discoveries came from examining the diversity of their DNA. In healthy, thriving populations, genetic variety is wide, offering a kind of resilience against disease and environmental change. For Neanderthals, however, that variety was surprisingly narrow, especially in fossils from their later years. It suggested that their groups were small and often isolated from one another. Over time, this isolation led to inbreeding, where close relatives had children together because there were so few unrelated partners to choose from. This was not a cultural choice but a survival necessity in scattered bands spread thinly across a harsh Ice Age landscape. Inbreeding left distinct signatures in their genetic code. Long stretches of DNA were found to be identical on both maternal and paternal copies of certain chromosomes, a sign that the parents of that individual shared a common ancestor not far back in their family tree. In one remarkable case, the remains of a Neanderthal woman revealed that her parents were as closely related as half-siblings or an uncle and niece. Such genetic closeness might not cause immediate collapse, but over generations, it can increase the risk of harmful genetic mutations becoming more common, affecting health, fertility, and survival. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down almost entirely from mothers to their children, offered another layer of insight. Unlike the DNA in the cell's nucleus, mitochondrial DNA is relatively short and mutates at a steady rate, making it a powerful tool for tracing maternal lineages through time. When scientists compared mitochondrial sequences from Neanderthals across different regions, they found that diversity was extremely limited. This suggested that their maternal lines had been contracting for thousands of years, with fewer and fewer branches left on the family tree. Such a pattern hints at long-term population decline well before their final disappearance. These genetic clues also allowed researchers to estimate when Neanderthal populations might have begun shrinking. The reduced variation pointed to a severe bottleneck at some point in their history, possibly caused by environmental disaster, disease, or conflict. From that point on, their numbers may never have recovered to earlier levels. Every birth and death mattered more in such small populations, and each loss could have a ripple effect through the genetic pool. The story written in their DNA does not just chart their biology, it also reflects the lives they lived. Each genetic marker is a shadow of choices made under pressure, of migrations into new territories, of families bound closely by necessity. It is a record of survival against odds that grew steeper with every generation, and it sets the stage for the final pockets where Neanderthals would make their last stand. As the Neanderthals' world shrank, they retreated into the few places that could still sustain them. Archaeological evidence shows that these final strongholds were scattered and far apart, like the last islands of a fading continent. One such place was the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula in what is now Gibraltar. Here, The climate was milder than much of Ice Age Europe, with rocky coastlines that provided shelter in caves and access to a steady supply of food from the sea. Layers of ash, stone tools, and animal remains found in sites like Gorham's Cave reveal that Neanderthals lived here long after they had vanished from most of the continent. In these sheltered coves, they hunted red deer and ibex, gathered shellfish, and used the caves as homes, their walls echoing with the sounds of a people holding on against time. Far away, on the opposite edge of their range, pockets of Neanderthal life persisted in the vast and frozen expanse of Siberia. In places like the Altai Mountains, cave sites show that these communities survived deep into the coldest millennia, their lives tied to the migrations of game and the cycles of the seasons. The caves of Denisova and Chagirskaya hold traces of their presence, tools shaped from stone, charred animal bones from cooking fires, and the occasional fragment of bone or tooth that still carries the story of a life lived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. These regions were difficult to reach, cut off by mountains, rivers, and glaciers, which may have shielded them from early contact with the expanding Homo sapiens populations further west and south. What these final places have in common is a geography that acted as both refuge and trap. In Gibraltar, the ocean provided food even when the land's resources ran thin, but the peninsula was limited in space, forcing small groups to live close together with little room to expand. In Siberia, remoteness gave safety from outside threats but also meant isolation, with only a few nearby groups to exchange mates and ideas with. The archaeological record shows that in these last centuries, their populations were already small. The stone tools found in these strongholds are fewer and sometimes less varied than in earlier periods, suggesting that the communities making them were stretched thin and focused on survival over innovation. Even in resource-rich areas, the signs of decline are clear. In Gibraltar, the abundance of shellfish and marine birds suggests that Neanderthals leaned heavily on these foods, perhaps because larger game had become harder to find. In Siberia, the bones of hunted animals show a narrowing range of prey as herds shifted their migration routes or became less numerous in the changing climate. With fewer animals to hunt and limited plant foods during the long winters, each season brought a greater struggle to meet basic needs. These final strongholds were the last flickers of a population that had once ranged from the Atlantic coasts to the eastern steppes. From these edges of the world, the Neanderthals' story would pass into its final chapter, where survival hung by a thread and each winter tested the limits of their endurance. On a cold evening in Ice Age Europe, the fading light would have cast long shadows over a campfire's glow. Around it, voices might have risen in quiet conversation, the sound of language carrying meaning, even if the words were not the same. Archaeologists studying layers of soil from certain sites have found tantalizing evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have once occupied the same places within a short span of time. In some cases, the difference is so slight that it suggests the possibility of direct interaction. The stone flakes left behind tell part of the story, their shapes and edges showing the distinct craftsmanship of each species, lying together in the same ancient earth. We can imagine a narrow valley where two groups cross paths. One carries spears of finely worked stone with wooden shafts polished by many hands. The other uses tools shaped in the style passed down through generations. The wind carries the scent of cooked meat, a sign of a meal shared, or perhaps of two separate meals prepared within sight of one another. The archaeological record cannot tell us if these encounters were peaceful exchanges, tense standoffs, or moments of curiosity but the possibility that they stood within sight of one another is enough to spark the imagination. Shared campsite evidence adds weight to the idea that their lives occasionally intertwined. Layers of charcoal from different fires, built in slightly different styles, lie within the same space. Animal bones split for marrow, some showing cut marks that match Neanderthal techniques, others bearing the finer slicing patterns linked to Homo sapiens, suggest the ground once held the footsteps of both. Perhaps one group moved on, and the other arrived soon after, using the same shelter against the cold wind, unaware or very aware that another kind of human had been there. For the Neanderthals, these encounters may have carried a different weight than for Homo sapiens. In the final centuries of their existence, their numbers were dwindling, their familiar hunting grounds shrinking. To see another human species thriving, bringing new tools, traveling in larger groups, and carrying goods from far-off lands could have been both fascinating and unsettling. For those who lived in the shadow of this change, there might have been an unspoken realization that they were part of something ending. The emotional depth of such moments is hard to measure through stone and bone, yet it is possible to imagine. A Neanderthal elder, watching younger members of the group with fewer companions than in his youth, might have wondered if the children before him would live to see another generation. A chance sighting of a group of Homo sapiens, healthy and numerous, might have stirred feelings that had no name, a quiet knowledge that the world was shifting in ways that could not be reversed. These last encounters, whether direct or indirect, would have been part of the Neanderthals' final experience of the world. In those moments, the lines between the familiar and the unfamiliar blurred as two human species stood on the same earth, breathing the same air, yet walking toward very different futures. For much of modern history, the image of the Neanderthal in popular culture has been one of a slow, brutish figure, broad-shouldered, stooped, dragging a club, speaking in grunts, and barely more intelligent than an animal. This picture, reinforced by early museum displays, cartoons, and films, was not built from evidence, but from assumption. The first Neanderthal skeletons discovered in the 19th century were studied in a world still shaped by the idea that humans were separate from nature, and any fossil of an ancient human relative had to fit neatly into a story of progress. In that story, Homo sapiens were the pinnacle, and Neanderthals were a crude, failed step along the way. One early fossil, reconstructed with a bent spine caused by disease, was mistakenly shown as the natural posture of all Neanderthals. This created the lasting impression that they walked hunched over. Artists painted them with vacant expressions, hair wild and eyes empty of thought. The label caveman was applied without hesitation, erasing any sense that these were complex beings with lives, emotions, and knowledge of their world. The stereotype stuck, not because it matched the truth, but because it fit a comforting narrative in which we were the smarter, stronger, destined survivors. The persistence of this image was helped by the lack of physical evidence available for many decades. Archaeological digs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often focused more on collecting impressive fossils than on studying them in context. Without careful excavation, the details of Neanderthal life remained hidden. Popular science books, written for wide audiences, leaned into dramatic language and illustrations that made Neanderthals seem primitive. Even school textbooks for much of the 20th century repeated outdated claims about their lack of intelligence. But science thrives on questioning, and as excavation techniques improved, so did the story. In recent decades, discoveries have overturned nearly every part of the old stereotype. Careful analysis of hearths shows that Neanderthals controlled fire well, cooking food and using flames for warmth and protection. Sites have revealed pigments and tools that may have been used for body decoration or art, suggesting symbolic thinking. Evidence of burials, sometimes with grave goods, points to ritual or emotional attachment to the dead. Wear patterns on teeth and bones show that they adapted tools for different tasks, not just for hunting, but for processing plants, working hides, and making clothing fitted for survival in cold climates. Genetic studies have added another dimension to the truth. By sequencing ancient DNA, scientists have confirmed that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, leaving a genetic legacy that still shapes aspects of our biology today. This finding erases the idea of a clean divide between us and them, showing instead a complex history of interaction and shared ancestry. The more we learn, the more the old image of the dim-witted caveman fades. Today, the Neanderthal is understood as a close human relative, intelligent, adaptive, and deeply human in their own way. Yet, even as science rewrites the narrative, the old myths still linger in popular media, a reminder of how slowly public perception changes compared to the speed of discovery. When we look at the disappearance of the Neanderthals, we are not only peering into the past, but also holding up a mirror to ourselves. Their fate is a reminder that survival is not always about strength, but about the ability to adapt when the world changes faster than expected. Neanderthals were strong, capable hunters, well suited for the environments they knew best. They thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, enduring freezing winters and dangerous predators. Yet when new pressures came, whether through climate instability, competition, or disease, the strategies that had worked for so long were no longer enough. Adaptability is more than having the right tools or techniques. It is the willingness to change them when needed, to adjust to new landscapes, new resources, and new challenges. Homo sapiens demonstrated this flexibility in ways that may have made the difference. They shifted hunting strategies when prey became scarce, expanded their diets, explored unfamiliar territories, and formed wider social networks that allowed knowledge to move from one group to another. Neanderthals, by contrast, often relied on familiar methods in familiar places, and when those places or methods failed, their options narrowed. Another key lesson lies in diversity. In biology, genetic diversity acts as a shield against sudden threats. A population with varied genes has a better chance of containing individuals who can survive new diseases, adapt to temperature changes, or handle shifts in food supply. Neanderthals, based on genetic studies, appear to have lived in relatively small and isolated groups for long stretches of time. This may have reduced their genetic variety and left them more vulnerable to problems that required a wider range of biological responses. In contrast, Homo sapiens maintained larger and more connected populations, keeping the genetic pool broader and more resilient. Diversity also matters in culture. The sharing of ideas, technologies, and survival strategies across different groups creates a living library of knowledge that can be drawn upon in a crisis. The more varied the skills and solutions within a society, the greater its chances of finding a workable answer when conditions shift. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens had broader cultural exchange networks, carrying tools, symbols, and innovations over vast distances. Neanderthals had cultural complexity too, but the smaller size and isolation of their communities may have slowed the spread of new ideas. These lessons echo far beyond prehistory. In our own time, humanity faces challenges that move quickly and affect the entire planet. Climate change, pandemics, ecosystem collapse, and the rapid pace of technological disruption are pressures that test our adaptability every day. Just as Neanderthals may have been caught in a web of changes that came too fast to manage, modern humans risk the same fate if we fail to respond quickly enough. The warning is clear. Survival is not guaranteed, even for a species that has dominated its environment. The ability to adjust to changing conditions, to keep our genetic and cultural diversity strong, and to maintain connections across communities is not a luxury but a necessity. The story of the Neanderthals is not only about how they lived and died, it is a reminder that nature does not favor the strongest or the most intelligent alone, but those who can adapt, cooperate, and find new ways forward when the old paths close. And as history has shown, those who cannot do so may one day be remembered only through the traces they leave behind. Even though the Neanderthals as a distinct people vanished tens of thousands of years ago, they did not disappear completely. A part of them still lives within us, woven into our very biology. Modern genetic studies have revealed that almost every person with ancestry outside of Africa carries a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA, often between 1 and 2%. This is not just an abstract number buried deep in our genetic code. These fragments of ancient DNA actively shape how our bodies function today, influencing everything from our immune systems to the way we process food. One of the most remarkable contributions comes in the form of immune defenses. Life in Ice Age Europe exposed Neanderthals to viruses and bacteria that Homo sapiens from Africa had never encountered. When our ancestors interbred with them, some of these immune-related genes were passed on, offering a head start in fighting off certain infections. Even now, some people carry Neanderthal variants in genes that help the body detect and respond to pathogens more quickly. It is as though a piece of their evolutionary experience was added to our own, strengthening our ability to survive in new environments. Neanderthal DNA also appears in genes linked to metabolism. Surviving in cold climates required efficient ways to store and use energy. Certain genetic variants from Neanderthals may have helped their bodies regulate fat storage, adjust insulin sensitivity, and handle diets heavy in animal protein. These same traits may have been valuable to our ancestors as they adapted to Ice Age conditions in Eurasia. Today, however, in a world where food is abundant and lifestyles are less physically demanding, some of these ancient adaptations may contribute to modern health challenges, such as a higher risk of obesity or type 2 diabetes in certain populations. The influence extends beyond the internal workings of the body and into our physical appearance. Some traits that people consider purely modern, such as certain hair colors, skin tones, and even aspects of facial structure, may trace back to Neanderthal ancestry. Variations in genes affecting keratin, the protein that strengthens skin, hair, and nails, appear to have come from them, possibly giving their descendants thicker hair or tougher skin. These traits would have been practical advantages in cold, harsh climates, helping the body conserve heat and resist damage from wind and ice. Researchers have also found hints that Neanderthal DNA may influence aspects of behavior and brain function. Some genetic variants linked to mood regulation, pain sensitivity, and sleep patterns appear to have been inherited from them. For example, certain sleep-related genes may have helped them adapt to longer winter nights at higher latitudes, altering circadian rhythms in subtle but lasting ways. There is even evidence that some Neanderthal genetic fragments are associated with a heightened sensitivity to certain types of pain or an increased risk of depression, showing that these ancient influences are complex, with both potential benefits and drawbacks. In this way, the Neanderthals are not just a chapter in the distant past. They are a living presence within us, shaping how we fight disease, respond to our environment, and even how we look and feel. Their story is not only carved into bones and stone tools, but written quietly in the code of our own bodies, carried forward through every generation that followed. And from here, the focus shifts from what they gave us to the mysteries that still remain, locked within our shared evolutionary history. For all that has been uncovered about the Neanderthals, there is still a vast space filled with silence. Archaeologists and geneticists have pieced together much of their story from bones, tools, and traces of DNA. Yet many questions remain unanswered. We know when their presence fades from the fossil record, but the precise sequence of events that led to their disappearance is still shrouded in uncertainty. The timeline is built from scattered clues, each one locked in layers of sediment, each telling only a fragment of the tale. The gaps are large enough that entirely new discoveries could shift the narrative in ways we cannot yet imagine. One of the greatest limitations in our understanding is the rarity of well-preserved remains. Time, weather, and shifting landscapes have erased countless traces of Neanderthal life. Most of what we have comes from caves, where conditions have slowed the decay of bone and preserved archaeological layers in relative safety. Yet even these sites yield only partial skeletons, worn and incomplete. This scarcity means that entire aspects of their biology, from their full range of physical diversity to finer details of their health, remain unknown. A single new find in the right condition could open windows into questions we have been unable to answer for decades. Among the most tantalizing possibilities is the discovery of frozen remains, perhaps locked in permafrost somewhere in Siberia or another cold region where Neanderthals once lived. In such places, low temperatures could have halted decay almost entirely, leaving skin, hair, and even soft tissues intact. To date, no such find has been made, but nature has preserved mammoths, woolly rhinos, and ancient bison in exactly this way. If a Neanderthal body were found under similar conditions, it could revolutionize our understanding. Scientists could extract complete genomes, study diet from stomach contents, and even see the true textures of their hair and skin. It would be as close as we could come to meeting them face to face. Even without frozen remains, there is hope for finding better preserved genetic material. Advances in ancient DNA extraction have already made it possible to recover fragments from bones tens of thousands of years old, even when the samples are degraded and contaminated. Techniques are improving so rapidly that it is likely future scientists will be able to reconstruct entire genomes from remains once thought impossible to analyze. Each new sequence adds more detail to the genetic map, revealing how Neanderthals were related to one another, how they moved across continents, and how they interacted with early Homo sapiens. The possibility that such discoveries could change the extinction story is not just theoretical. In the past few decades, the narrative has already been rewritten multiple times. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing image was that Neanderthals were a separate, inferior species that died out when modern humans arrived. Then genetic evidence revealed they were not entirely gone at all, and that interbreeding had been part of the story. Archaeological finds showing symbolic behavior, art, and advanced tool use challenge the idea that they were less intelligent. Every decade has brought evidence that makes them more human in our eyes, blurring the lines that once seemed so clear. In the layers of Earth still waiting to be studied, there could be answers that surprise us yet again. Perhaps there are artifacts that reveal a richer cultural life, or fossils that show they survived longer in certain regions than we thought. Perhaps there are clues pointing to a catastrophe we have not yet considered, or to patterns of interaction with Homo sapiens more complex than either pure competition or peaceful coexistence. Until those discoveries are made, the Neanderthal story will remain open-ended, its final chapters still unwritten, as the trail leads us toward the closing moments of their existence. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals walked the same earth we do now. They hunted, built shelters, cared for their young, and endured some of the harshest climates nature could offer. They were not a footnote in the story of humanity, but a chapter that lasted far longer than our own civilization has yet managed. And yet, within a blink in evolutionary time, they were gone from the landscapes they once ruled. The winds still sweep across the valleys where they lived. The rivers still cut through the plains they crossed, but their voices, their laughter, and their struggles have faded into silence. The mystery of their disappearance is not one single story, but a tapestry woven from many threads. Climate upheavals tested their endurance. Shifts in ecosystems reshaped the hunting grounds they relied on. The arrival of Homo sapiens brought new competition, new diseases, and new ways of thinking and organizing that may have tipped the balance. Interbreeding blurred the lines between them and us, while shrinking populations and isolation made it harder for their communities to recover from each blow. Every discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, yet the picture is never quite complete. But the story is not one of total loss. Every one of us alive today who carries even a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA is living proof that they are still here in some way. Their genes whisper through our biology, shaping how our immune systems respond to threats, how our bodies adapt to different environments, and even how we process certain nutrients. In this way, they are not only our ancestors in spirit, but our companions in flesh, their legacy etched into the very code of our being. We are not the only humans left because they vanished entirely. We are the only humans left because part of them became part of us. When we look at a fossilized skull in a museum or see the marks of stone tools that have lain buried for tens of thousands of years, we are looking at the echoes of a people who were far more like us than we once believed. This understanding should make us wonder how many other stories of human origins remain incomplete, waiting for the right discovery to bring them back to light. The Neanderthal mystery reminds us that history is never fixed. It shifts as we learn more, as new evidence emerges from the ground, and as science gives us sharper tools to read the past. The last Neanderthal campfire may have burned out long ago, but their presence lingers in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. Perhaps you have your own theory about why they disappeared or what their final years were like. Were they outcompeted, outlasted, or simply absorbed into a larger human story? I would love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's explore the possibilities together. If you want to journey deeper into mysteries like this one, from lost civilizations to the secrets of space and the forces that shape our planet, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are so many more questions to ask, and each one takes us further into the wonders of science, history, and the story of us all.